Ludlow Lagoon is an amusement park, but it's more than that.
Ludlow Lagoon Amusement Park was an amazing showcase of what the amusement parks were at the turn of the century.
The Ludlow Lagoon really was a Victorian playground. It was a place to be seen and to see.
The Ludlow Lagoon Amusement Park was a place of culture, of relaxation, a place of community for not only the town of Ludlow, but for all the surrounding towns.
There was easily 11,000 people that would visit it in a day.
We had our little place in history.
It had state-of-the-art amusement rides, roller coasters, Ferris wheels, panoramas, cycloramas.
And it was a source of pride. It was a huge source of pride for the people who lived here, that they lived in a town that had something so amazing.
It's something that's always been part of my imagination and something I've always thought about and wished that I could have experienced. Most of us have fond memories of going to amusement parks, of having that experience as children, or having that experience of taking your children to an amusement park. And knowing that there was such a large park in northern Kentucky at one time that drew so many people, you know, that's something that we can all relate to because we've all experienced that excitement and fun of going to an amusement park.
The people in Ludlow originally were very wealthy people who moved from Cincinnati. When the railroad came through, W.S. Ludlow signed an agreement with the railroad that for 99 years they could use his property. It was a lease, and that as long as there was a passenger train that came by, it would have to stop in Ludlow. That was his agreement, which was a very smart thing to do.
That really changed how Ludlow existed. And so the community really was transformed by that railroad coming into the city. In 1894, they decided to develop streetcar service to the city of Ludlow.
The streetcar was an important part of the park. That had to be in place before anything else took place. When the incorporation papers were filed, one of the people who was listed on those incorporation papers was J.J. Shepard. He was the head of the streetcar company. So they were on board from the very beginning.
And the idea was to provide quick transportation between Covington and Cincinnati and the city of Ludlow.
The streetcar would have changed everything for the town and for the park.
J.J. Weaver was really the major backer of the park and really the driving force that developed the park.
J.J. Weaver must have been a true character.
He would be the Walt Disney of the Ludlow Lagoon because he didn't bring just very simple things. What he brought was really innovative things, cutting edge things, things that you didn't see anywhere else. And so it made the Ludlow Lagoon Park a really special place.
He was good at what he did because he was able to travel around. If there was something that he wanted, it seemed like he went to great lengths to obtain it. For the time that the Ludlow Lagoon was popular, I mean, it's just amazing what all he was able to accomplish.
In the late 19th century, as streetcars were starting through towns, the owners of those streetcar companies would create destination points to get more riders.
So Weaver was looking at a way to draw more people to the end of the streetcar line, which he was a heavy investor in.
The Lagoon Lake was built in 1894. A 400-foot dam was erected
to block the water going into the Ohio River on the Pleasant Run Creek between Ludlow and Bromley. And the result of that dam was an 85-acre lake with 5 islands.
And it would have been right about 100 acres because that was the land that had been sold by William Ludlow and donated. People came from all over. They came from Cincinnati. They came from further in Kentucky. The railroad made it very easy for people to come, get off in Ludlow, take the little trolley car down to the Lagoon Park. It is said that they arrived every few minutes. So, I mean, they were bringing thousands of people quickly.
There was a smaller trolley called the Dinky that would just do a continuous loop from that trolley stop over to the entrance to the Lagoon Park.
They would then approach the main entrance, and the main entrance was a building designed by a Ludlow architect, John Bowl. It was 2 turrets, and in the middle was a formal entryway. And so you would buy your ticket there, and that's how you would enter the park.
The main entrance was a beautiful Victorian chateau-esque wood frame structure. You would walk through the gate, and on the other side of the gate was a grass parkway. And you could go to the right, and there was the clubhouse.
The clubhouse was kind of the center of the park. It was the building that drew attention. It was one of the largest buildings on the property.
The clubhouse was, I believe, one of the first buildings that was built. I think the purposing changed over time.
They did offer entertainment, and then of course they would offer dancing, and they would have good food and just everything that would draw people into that.
But it was set up mostly as a fine dining restaurant, and so they were serving really fine cuisine. Most people that were going to the park maybe could not afford to dine in it, so there was an exclusiveness about the clubhouse that kind of gave it a mystique as well.
The clubhouse had a dining room on the first floor and billiard room on the second floor, and a veranda, 15-foot wide veranda all the way around it, where they would serve food and beer and overlook the lake.
It had a walkway that went down right to the lake's edge, and it had a really nice view just of the whole park.
You think of Disneyland and the castle at the lagoon, you would think of the clubhouse. The clubhouse was something that kind of drew people to it.
The Ludlow Historic Society made a 3D digital recreation of the Lagoon Amusement Park. The interesting thing that you can do having a three-dimensional model is that you can place yourself in any location within the park. And so there are thousands of postcards about Ludlow Lagoon Amusement Park. And you can place yourself in the exact same view, see the railroad bridge in the background, imagine the midway and the beer gardens and the motorcycle track and a scenic railway right there in that same view as if you were there 100 years ago.
The rides that were on the upper level of the park, and some of those were the Ferris wheel, the circle swing, which basically was a large tower that had chains hanging off of it with seats, and you would sit in the seat, it would revolve, and eventually the riders would spin around in a circle. Other things on that upper level would have been the theater. The amphitheater was kind of a transition. So when you got to the lower part of the park, you got closer towards the lake, and when you got closer towards the lake, you were looking at the boathouse, the bathing beach. The midway was in the lower section of the park, as well as the moving picture show, which was one of the first in Northern Kentucky. It was started in 1909, where they were showing motion pictures. One of the major influences on the lagoon was the Columbian Exposition of 1893, which was held in Chicago. And if you look at the lagoon and compare it to the Columbian Exposition, there's some things that are very similar.
J.J. Weaver, he was very inspired by that. He wanted other people to be able to experience that too. You see a lot of that in what he brought to the Ludlow Lagoon project.
All the buildings were designed by Ludlow architect John Bowl, were built in this neoclassical white design. So he was kind of pulling off the Columbian Exposition in that way.
Heaven's going to break, and the water gonna come, and I have no place to stay. Well, all last night I sat on the lever and moaned. Well, all last night I sat on the lever and moaned.
J.J. Weaver was very much interested in educating people and letting people know what the world outside of their local surroundings were like.
The midway was something that was invented at the Columbian Exposition. They were trying to find a way to pay for the exposition, and so they set aside a portion of the park where they had games of chance, where they had performers, where they did all of this kind of carnival types of things. And so when they developed the lagoon, they were very intentional on putting in a midway. It was one of the first midways in the Midwest. So there's a section of the lagoon from the very early time period that had knife-throwing booths, that had ring toss booths, that had food booths. So they were selling waffles, they were selling ice cream. One of the things that we think of the midway today at circuses in particular is the freak show, which is not a politically correct term, but it was something that was quite common during this time period. Along with them, they oftentimes had preserved specimens of different human beings or different human being parts. When they were doing some work on the lagoon, long after it had closed, they found some body parts at the lagoon when they were building a new structure.
They found some things from the freak show. There was a two-headed baby. Needless to say, that caused some problems.
They called in the police, they called in the sheriff, and they assumed that a murder had occurred. Well, they found out that it was part of one of those displays from when the lagoon was actually active. One of the major attractions at the lagoon, particularly on the Midway, was called the Edisonian exhibit.
Edison's things were so innovative and so spectacular. Everything he did was so spectacular that it would make sense that people would want to see more because there was so much to see.
To be able to go to the Edisonian exhibit and to see some of his inventions and some of the things that he actually built with his own hands was very exciting to people. One of the other world events that had an impact on the lagoon was the Russo-Japanese War. The lagoon owners built what they call the Japanese Fair or the Japanese Pavilion.
There was quite a fascination at that time with countries of the Far East, China and Japan.
They had 5 geisha girls who came. They brought artifacts from Japan and decorated it to be like a Japanese tea garden would be. And it again gave people another way of seeing a new culture.
The Midway was something that drew a lot of people to the park for entertainment and was a direct result of that visit by the backers to the Columbian Exposition. When the park opened, one of the original attractions was a miniature gold mine. There was still that thought back to the gold rushes in California and Alaska, and so gold mining and hitting it big was something that was very popular in the American psyche. Every season they tried to come up with a different attraction or something new that would draw people. You could say, well, I went last season. Well, there's this and this and this that's new. They were always looking at ways of improving the park, coming up with new, exciting opportunities for people to learn something or to have fun. And so the park evolved and changed each season. One of the ways that the lagoon stayed on the cutting edge was looking for new technology. In 1896, they contracted with Paul Boynton. Boynton was an inventor of rides, and particularly water rides. He also ran what he called the Paul Boynton Water Carnival. One of the things that he designed, and it was one of the first of its kind in Ludlow, was what was called the Chute the Chutes. Riders climbed a large tower.
A boat would start at the top, and people would be in the boats, and they would ride down the incline at an accelerated speed, and they would skim across the lake.
You can almost call it an early log flume.
I think amazing things about the Chute the Chutes was the speed at which they came down, which was 37 miles an hour, which most likely had something to do with its demise in the end because people began to get hurt. That is awfully fast.
People were getting injured as the boat kind of skidded across the water or hit the water.
It sounded like from the writings that it was fun at first, but one too many back injuries, one too many hard rides made them close it. The aerial roadway was a very large ride that took up a lot of space in the park. It started near the Midway and took off from there.
You would actually get on a Buick automobile. And it's interesting if you look at the photographs of how it operated. They were on a track that had a central steel beam. And if you look at modern day car rides today, they're operating off the exact same technology. There's still that metal beam that goes down the center of the ride that keeps the car on the track.
And you can see postcards of people riding on this track, and the term autoing in the treetops as people drove through the treetops, the tree canopy, as this was a 20-foot high roadway.
If you look at the photographs of people riding those cars, it's very unusual because you will see many of the men sitting as passengers and you see the women driving.
For any woman to drive a car, oh my goodness, you know, that's crazy. It was something that just didn't happen. So it would have been one of the most popular rides that people could take. And if you look at the actual pictures of them, how amazing is it to see them in this old car with the clothes that they wore back then?
This was one of the few opportunities really in Victorian society where women could drive a car and it was considered acceptable. And so it's kind of a liberating experience for many women who came to the park because they were able to drive a car. And for many of them, it was the only time they ever drove a car. If I had one favorite ride, it would be the Scenic Railway. Just because it was on the cutting edge. You know, the backers of the park were so interested in its success that they were looking at the experts in the field and were willing to have LaMarcus Thompson, the inventor of the modern roller coaster, design a ride for Ludlow. That's just amazing to me. Ludlow being a railroad town and the Midwest being a railroad-dominated area in the country, they built a miniature railroad that basically circumvented the lake. And it was small steam-powered engines that pulled cars that were built for riders. So the tracks actually went over the lake. When you got to the end where the corkscrew was, you went into a building.
There is a interesting image of the Scenic Railway roller coaster as it goes into this corkscrew structure at the end as you go up 2 stories to come back. And you can see from the photo that as you go in, it's dark on the first level, and on the walls are pictures of nature scenes and very organic sculptures that are on the wall. As they talk about the 4 seasons, the spring, summer, fall, and winter, in the dark and purposefully lit theatrical dioramas on the wall.
And I'm not sure if it went through a different level each time and there was just a different scene on each level that created that, or if the scenery on the one level changed each time they were coming through to create the 4 seasons.
Over time, the scenes on the inside of the corkscrew were changed, but the ride basically remained the same throughout the entire existence of the park. And we see that as kind of a primitive roller coaster today. At that time, that was cutting edge, and people were had never seen anything like this before. To ride in an open car on rails over a lake was very adventurous, and there were many women and men that were afraid to even get on the thing. But it became extremely popular, and it was something that drew people back over and over again because of the novelty of it.
JJ traveled quite a bit, always scouting for ideas, scouting for things he could bring to the park.
Hot air balloons had been developed during the American Civil War as a way of kind of keeping track of what was going on the opposing side. And so the technology had been building up for the last 30 years, last 40 years.
The hot air balloons must have been very popular. He was doing his scouting, he found this going on somewhere else, he obtained them and brought them to the lagoon.
The lagoon was one of the first parks in the Midwest to offer hot air balloon rides. This was before the era of flight for most people and before the era of skyscrapers, at least in our part of the country. And so getting a bird's eye view of anything was very unique. They got the excitement, but they also got the views of the park, and you could even see into downtown Cincinnati. One of the more interesting things I think that happened was on several occasions the balloon actually did break loose. It drifted downriver for the most part and was usually retrieved somewhere around Crescent Springs or Villa Hills and brought back to the park. Some people got more for their money than others. The park was fortunate enough to use its landscape to improve the park and the experience, and one of the ways they did that was they built a natural amphitheater in the park using the terrain that was available and built a large stage. The Royal Hungarian Orchestra played on that stage. There were many well-known vaudeville acts during the time that performed in the amphitheater and in the indoor theater. Those venues attracted people of note. There were a number of visitors to the park that really drew large crowds. Ludlow was very much a union town, so Labor Day was celebrated as a day where laborers could come to the park, and they would have specific days for different unions. Some of the visitors included Samuel Gompers, who was a major union leader during the time period.
Eugene Debs came to the park and spoke, and he was a labor leader at the time.
Those two gentlemen had international reputations and drew extremely large crowds.
Others who were here were an actor by the name of Maurice Barrymore. He was the start of the Barrymore acting dynasty, and John and Ethel and even Drew Barrymore is a descendant of his. Another one that was the leading lady of the Lagoon. She was an actress and a singer, and she married Tyrone Power Sr., and it was her son Tyrone Power Jr. that became the famous actor in the movies and things.
President Taft visited the Lagoon at one time. The Royal Hungarian Orchestra actually was touring the United States. Weaver and one of the managers named J.J. Noonan attracted them and brought them to the park.
The lake was an attraction in itself. Not only was it at the geographical center of the park, but it was the main attraction.
Without the lake, you wouldn't have had the boats, you wouldn't have had the islands, people would have had nowhere to bathe. It gave a different atmosphere. It was a coolness in a time when we didn't have air conditioning. You know, people could go and cool off. And I would say that in that point in time, that was huge.
The lake was basically about 85 acres, so it was a large lake, man-made, and so the depth was very uneven. It was as low as 18 feet in some locations and as deep as 45 in other locations. It was well suited to many recreational purposes. For swimming, it was used extensively. Boating was a big activity.
If you look at any of the postcards that still exist from back then, you are going to see those boats.
The 5 islands were used for different purposes throughout the park's history. At times they had rides on them, at other times they had living history exhibitions on them. At other times they were just kept kind of natural, and people could take the boat ride out to the island, eat a picnic lunch on the island, and then return to the shores. Young couples particularly enjoyed the boat rides and the islands during that time period, so they were used for many different purposes during the history of the lagoon.
I think the function for the islands, most likely, part of it was to have a place where people could sunbathe or, you know, just sit, have a picnic, or spend time together. But part of it was for those exhibits that they had, which gave people the different cultures.
In 1898, the Spanish-American War breaks out. What they decided to do was the owners set aside one of those islands on the lake. They found a refugee family from Cuba. They had nowhere to go. The park actually built them a thatch hut and built what they considered to be an accurate Cuban farm. Wasn't really an accurate Cuban farm, but it served the purpose.
The Cuban family that lived on the islands was there to show what life in the Caribbean was like. That was something that people, especially local people, had never experienced.
You would buy a ticket, you would take a boat out to the island, and then you could experience what life was like in Cuba. And so it was kind of a way to not only entertain people, but also, in a rudimentary way, educate people on world affairs.
They were just really good about taking advantage of what was going on at the time or in the news or whatever, and thought, you know, people would be interested in finding this out. So sure enough, they bring people in from Cuba, why not?
People were going out onto the lake and coming back in, especially at night or at dusk when the lights were on. What an amazing scene that must have been for people coming back in after a long day at the park and, you know, resting on the boat and seeing the park laid out, all lit up on the side of the lake. Must have been really something at that time period. One of the things that the park did extremely well was lighting. And, you know, we take that for granted today because, you know, electric lighting is so common. In the 1890s, early 1900s, electricity was, relatively new, and it was something that people didn't even have in their homes. And so lighting was used not only on the rides, but it was there were light stanchions put up surrounding most of the lake. It was something that was very unusual in the area and drew a lot of people just because of the size of the park, and that the whole park was lit. It was an attraction all unto itself.
The Motordrome opened in 1913. When this opened, it was part of a national craze of motorcycle racing across the nation. People were amazed at the speeds. There are new gasoline-powered motorcycles that could go 80, 90 miles an hour, but the need for speed was also very dangerous.
As far as the Motordrome goes, I know that it was a very popular event. If you look at any of the postcards or the pictures, you see a lot of people. They were very impressed by that. I think, unfortunately, the biggest thing that you hear about it is the Motordrome accident.
One of the things that they insisted upon was a safety measure, and they put a wire mesh that separated the track from the bleacher. Right between were lampposts that lit up the property, and they were gas fired. And on the evening of July 30th, 1913, they had a number of motorcycle riders from across the country participating. One of the more well-known, his name was Odin Johnson, and he was from Salt Lake City. Johnson was racing, going quite well, and one of his tires blew, which threw his motorcycle into that wire mesh. It kept the motorcycle from going into the stands. Unfortunately, it did, however, penetrate enough that it knocked over one of the gas lamps. It spewed burning oil onto the crowd.
When a motorcycle has a gasoline tank and also hits gas lamps, there's going to be a fire.
And so panic ensued. There were thousands of people, and the place was on fire. 100 or more people suffered burns of some severity. Odin Johnson's skull was fractured. He was taken to St. Elizabeth Hospital and died.
His wife was there and was pregnant at the time.
And she was treated not for burns, but for shock. And in the end, at least 10 people died that evening or in the following days from burns.
We think now when something happens, they call the fire department, call 911, somebody's there, everything happens quickly. But it was a different time and a different place. They didn't have those things to do, but yet people who had cars, who were there, took people to the hospital, people they didn't even know, but they took them to the hospital to try to save lives.
I think the wreck in the Lagoon Amusement Park was probably the worst one in the nation. And so people were starting to get tired of how dangerous they were.
The Motordrome owners decided that they were going to repair the Motordrome, and you see some editorials in the local newspapers that are very vehemently against this death trap, they called it, opening. And there's one of the Grim Reaper stirring a Motordrome with a spoon with people hanging off of it, being burnt. There was another editorial cartoon of the entrance to the Motordrome as a skull. Yet those who were behind the business of the Motordrome decided to carry on. The first day that it reopened after that tragic accident of July 30th, nobody was sitting in the front 5 rows. That's where most of the people had died. And so people were still interested in the races, but weren't willing to take the chance of sitting in those front rows.
There were 4 major factors that led to the end of the amusement park. First, in 1913, there was a devastating flood that ruined a lot of the buildings.
It was very expensive. At one point, they filed for bankruptcy, and they were in bankruptcy for a while, and they were kind of taken over by the Ludlow Realty Company for a while because it was in such dire financial straits. Somehow, J.J. Weaver always pulled it out.
The 1913 Motordrome accident also had a negative impact on the park. It was associated with the park, and that negative association cut down on visitors to the park.
And you had lawsuits coming in over that fact, and it was, by that time, I think it was just a matter of time, you know, before things just got to where they couldn't keep up with it anymore.
Also in 1915 was a tornado that tore through Ludlow and into Cincinnati. A lot of the buildings were torn off their foundations. Sides of buildings were ripped off. A lot of the structure in the park were cast iron columns and beams, but with canvas covering. And so the canvas just went in the tornado. It's ripped off.
Interestingly enough, the promoters of the park used it to their advantage, or tried to, and were running ads in the local newspaper saying the roof is off at the park, the roof's off at the lagoon, but still come and enjoy, we're still open. The major blow to the park, and really the major thing that led to its closure, was the U.S. entry into World War I. There was a great need for grain. Grain was being rationed, and so there was a temporary prohibition on alcohol. Most people were coming to the park not only for the rides, but also for the libations. You know, they were coming to have a good time, and alcohol was part of our culture in Greater Cincinnati, strong German, Irish population. And so not having beer really cut into the profits and led to the closure of the park.
The primary reasons that the Ludlow Lagoon Park finally closed was the Motordrome accident, it was the floods, it was the tornado, and then Prohibition.
So with beer sales down, buildings destroyed, floods coming in, one thing after another, just too many things happening at once to the amusement park led to its closing.
The end of the Lagoon Park happened very quickly. Once they decided that they could not bring it back, they got a wrecking ball and down it came. The Ludlow Lagoon Lake, it's very interesting, was really around for a long time. For many, many years after the park closed.
My personal recollections of Ludlow deal with my childhood. In the winter, we would go down there and ice skate. That's where I learned how to play hockey. We were playing hockey on the lake. There was enough water at that time period that when the lake froze over, skating was still very viable. And so we spent lots of winters at the lagoon.
Well, the park itself was closed, but the lake still remained an attraction for decades to come. And during the summer, it was a popular spot for fishing and boating still.
It was a big open green space with woods and a stream, and it was just something that attracted the kids of Ludlow. And usually their mothers told you, don't go to the lagoon. The first thing we did was run to the lagoon.
Well, I've heard stories of people ice skating on it all the way up through the 60s. I heard a great story from one gentleman who was ice skating on it as a child, and he had heard that the lake was 20 feet deep, and he fell through the ice, and his first thought was, oh no, and he landed 3 feet deep in the mud. So he was able to get out. But that tells you how much the lake had silted in up to the last days.
In 1967, the Ludlow Realty Company sold the lagoon property, the remaining lagoon property, which was primarily the lake, to the Carlisle Construction Company and the King Construction Company. Those two companies began using the property for fill.
I have heard that there was still trucks coming over to and dumping debris and filling the lake. Same time they were taking down Crosley Field. So Crosley Field may be inside the fill of the lake. And now it is just a unused forested land. The creek is still running through there. You can still see the creek, but it is no longer the wonder that it was, the 85-acre lake with thousands of people visiting it every day.
When it was gone, I would say it was a source of sadness. Certainly growing up in Ludlow, it was a source of sadness for me that I didn't get to experience that, because it was such an amazing thing.
The stories never kind of go away. They keep being retold by the next generation. Many people in northern Kentucky, their grandparents or their great-grandparents will tell those stories about meeting one another at the park or going to the park in the summer, and so that's kept the mystique and the story of the lagoon alive. There are a number of things that still tell the story of the lagoon.
There still remains some foundations in the hillside, the steps that lead from the lakefront up to the top of the grassy park area. And also in that same area, you can see some remnants of the old amphitheater.
The clubhouse still stands. The custodian's residence also still is standing, and it was where the major caretaker lived.
It's important to remember what history you have in your town. This history gives your town character, and it also gives it a sense of place.
When we've got Kings Island these days and Coney Island, but when you think back this was 100 years ago, that's what impresses me, is just how amazing it was for the time.
Now, you can stand at the top of the stairs that are still in the woods and just imagine the calliopes and the people talking and people laughing and running and on the boats on the water, and stand there and just imagine yourself being there at that time. It just amazes me to do that.
I just think that when people find out about the size of the property and the number of people that were attending, they're just amazed that this existed in Ludlow, was such a important part of Ludlow's history, and vanished so quickly. It was like a match, it burned brightly for a few decades and then it was gone.
It's part of that lure of that time period, People want to experience that, want to know what that felt like, and it's something they can only do in their imagination.
There's always that, I wish I knew. I wish I knew what it was like.
The Ludlow Lagoon Amusement Park is now a distant memory. It was an 85-acre lake with amusement park rides and buildings and thousands of people, and now it is a quiet, sleepy stream flowing through the woods.
If I had a time machine, that's the first place I would go. I would love to go back and visit the lagoon and see what the rides were like and see what people were talking about, and if I could just go and spend one day at the lagoon and just see what that was all about. That would be amazing.